It's very, very unusual. Yeah. Greetings, brothers and sisters. I am thankful for the privilege again to be able to share with you. It's very, very unusual. Yeah, unusual. A little disconcerting to be speaking like this without an audience. It's always a little harder when I can't see your faces. But I have no doubt that the Lord will still use this message to be a blessing. So I want to welcome everyone again to the camp meeting. And I trust that you're all being very, very blessed. Today, well, before I go any further, I'd like to just ask the Lord's presence on the meeting. So please bow your head with me. Father, thank you so much with all our hearts. Thank you for the privilege of meeting together and of sharing together from your word. Father, I know that I can say nothing to really bring a blessing unless you water and bless this truth, unless you give me the words and the inspiration. Please help me that I may be able to do justice to your word and that these, my brothers and sisters, may be truly blessed as we share together. Thank you, Father. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, I'd like to entitle my presentation today, Faith and the New Covenant. I really want to express my appreciation to our Father for bringing these thoughts to my mind, because one of the things that really make me very appreciative of the way God has worked in my life recently is that, many of the questions I've had in my mind, there are always questions. There are many things that we don't understand and that we might never understand. But some of the hard questions, God has really been helping me to, He has been directing me to answers. And I'm really very appreciative of this. And in this subject of faith and the new covenant, I have been able to also obtain some answers to some of my hard questions. And I hope it will be a blessing to you as we go through together. So I want to start well, whether it's morning or evening there, I'm not sure, but I want to start today with establishing that there are certain fundamental truths to the the concept of Christianity, to the understanding of what is going on in a controversy between God and Satan. There are some fundamental truths that we have to get at the beginning. If you're familiar with the ideas of Christendom in general, you know that probably every denomination that you move to, every group of Christians, they have a different concept of what is really going on with the contest between good and evil. And there are many ideas that really are they don't have a logical progression. The ideas don't fit together properly. And part of the reason is because there is not a solid foundation on which these ideas are based. And so I believe that in understanding, in approaching Christianity, in approaching Christian understanding, it's very important that we get the foundations right. Recently, in our online fellowship, we had some people with us who believed in predestination, and we had one or two occasions when we had discussions with them. But listening to the things that they shared, it brought home to my mind more forcefully how if you don't have a solid foundation, the structure you're building is going to be really faulty. And so I think it's important at the beginning to lay this foundation. And with that in mind, I want to highlight two things that I believe are the great fundamental issue that we need to understand. Number one, it is that God is a God of love. All right, that's not really it's not an issue. It's a truth. God is a God of love. There are many there are many things that people believe which do not coincide with this truth. And I'll just use one. I'll just use one thing as an example. The doctrine of eternal burning hell, the doctrine of a God who is a God of love, who is going to roast sinners in an unflinching fire, in an unchanging fire, in a never ceasing fire for all the years of eternity. The idea that God is love and that God will do this. For the slightest transgression, you will roast forever and ever and ever. God deliberately keeps you alive so you can suffer for eternity. And yet, God is love. This is what I mean when I talk about irreconcilable ideas. I believe that one of the great foundations on which we build everything is the principle that God is love. Anything you read in the Bible or anywhere else, but I'm referring to the Bible, anything you read that is inconsistent with this idea of God is love, you know that either A, you have a lot more understanding to do to obtain on this subject. You don't understand it, or you're not reading properly. I know that there are passages in the Bible that seem to speak of God doing things that are not loving. They are in the Bible. And what we know is when we come to these passages, we need to understanding. We don't have proper understanding. We can say that right from the beginning because God is love. That's foundational. So if it doesn't seem to be based on love, if it doesn't make sense in light of love, I don't understand it. You don't understand it. And we need to keep searching for proper understanding. So this is one of the great foundations. And the other one that I want to mention is the foundation that everything, because of God's love, He has created a universe of intelligent beings and that their service is based on freedom of choice. Freedom of choice is the other or is another great principle that I want to emphasize. Freedom of choice. There is a third, well, there are probably many other fundamental truths, but there's a third that I have emphasized and that I still believe is important, which is the principle of the law of consequence, the law of consequence. I'm not going to talk about that today, but I just mention it since I'm talking about great fundamental foundations. Today, what I'm talking about is the principle of free choice. This, I believe, is the great foundational understanding that helps us to understand many things. Why do babies die? Why do children suffer? Why do innocent people go through so much pain? Why is it that there is so much that seems unjust and unfair and unequal in this world? And why is it that God does not intervene? Because many times people will say, if I had the power, I would intervene. I would interfere. I would put an end to injustice. I would put an end to all this display of wickedness. I would interfere on behalf of the innocent. Why is God so silent and why is He so impotent? Yet we say He is almighty and we say that God is love. This is because we need to understand the principle of freedom of choice. God does not interfere with freedom of choice. He can't, because if He does, then He's being a dictator. He can't, because if He does, he's creating a universe that is based on dictatorship. It is based on It's almost like you would say we're all nothing but puppets. We're nothing but machines. We're great. There's a great game that God is playing, and the game is full of puppets, robots. He is the master who just pulls the strings, and we just conform and we just obey without the freedom to choose and to make decisions and to have a say in our destiny, because we have no freedom to choose. And yet, if we are free to choose, then it must be that we are free. Freedom means also the freedom to experience the consequences of what we choose. God can't make us free to choose and then interfere to stop the consequences. This is not freedom. This is manipulating the universe to suit the mind of one person. And if we're free, we have to be free. We have to be free in the fullest sense, so that when we make decisions, we also suffer the consequences of those decisions, or enjoy the consequences, whether they are negative or positive. So this is the next great. These are the other two great foundational truths that we need to understand: the law of consequence and the principle of free choice. Now, there's something that I never understood very clearly for a long time, but in this, well, I had an idea of it, but I never saw the importance of it until recently. I was having a discussion with a young lady, and it came up. So I want to focus on these two things, because they're tied into this principle of free will. Now, there are several things that can hinder free choice. Of course, if I am made just like a robot, then of course I don't have the freedom to choose. And you know that nobody nobody who is intelligent and who is not slightly crazy can enjoy relationships with something that has no mind, no freedom of choice. Today they're focused on artificial intelligence, and they're making robots. And it's interesting, if you go on YouTube and you look up some of these robots, they're trying to put in expressions on their faces, and they're programming them so that they can respond to your answers to your questions in an appropriate way. They almost seem to be intelligent. Okay, you ask questions and they give you an answer that fits right with your question. But you know that this is programming. You know that these robots don't have a mind that can really think independently and make decisions. If a robot says, "I love you, I care for you," it means nothing. This voice is a product of machines following a certain pattern that is pre-programmed. You can't really respond to this as a person unless you are kind of sick. You have a perverted mind. This is what God would have been creating if he did not make free will and free choice. He would have been creating robots. The God of the universe was looking for something more than simply a universe of toys. He was looking for intelligence, feeling, and most importantly, he was looking for free choice, because God is great. God is almighty. And yet, for God to be really in a universe that he can enjoy, he needs beings who have freedom of choice. It's not really that we need to be on the same level of God as far as intelligence is concerned, but as far as freedom is concerned, we need to be on the same level. And I can demonstrate that. My latest grandchild is less than a year old. My son is in his 40s, in his early 40s. I can enjoy a relationship with my 40-year-old son and with my 8 months old grandson. I can enjoy a relationship. As a matter of fact, sometimes my relationship with my grandson is more is closer to my heart than the momentary interaction I might have with my son, because my grandson, I watch him responding. He's now responding. He can ignore me or he can respond. Last night, he was sitting behind me and he kept grabbing my shoulder and pulling me backwards and having fun. I was enjoying it as a grandfather because it's his choice. He's free. He's free to play with somebody else, but he's interacting with me. So I find that pleasurable. If this was simply a toy, a robot pre-programmed, the novelty of it, the amazing thing that people could create something like this might interest me for a while. But for the robot to keep, hanging on to my shirt and pulling me back, after a while that becomes tedious and boring. There's nothing behind it because it's just a machine pre-programmed to behave a certain way. So the point I'm making, and I hope we're understanding, is that one of the great elements of relationships is freedom of choice. When a woman says to a man, "I love you," it means a lot to him because she has choice. She can choose not to say this. She can choose somebody else. I mean something to her. This is why she says, "I love you." Not because I force or compel her, but because she wants to. This is the way relationships work. And so freedom of choice is extraordinarily fundamental, important to the life of the universe. And in everything that he is doing, God operates on the basis of freedom of choice. And even when people hurt, and if people even die because of their choices, God leaves people to the choices they make, because this is the great principle of true freedom. And I hope we can understand this. So when a person chooses to take a certain direction and it brings disaster upon his family, upon those in his environment, it's his choice. And we have talked about this before. This is what Adam did. When Adam brought sin into the world, he brought death with sin. He brought disaster upon his family. God did not stop the course of what happened. The entire human race came under the consequences of Adam's action because of the principle of free choice. And of course, we see that all over the Bible. We see that in when Ham did when Ham carried out his strange act against his father, and the curse fell upon his son Canaan. It fell upon his descendants. We see it in the principle that God says when the certain people in Israel committed abominations, they turned to apostasy. The entire nation suffered the consequences. It's the principle of freedom of choice and the consequences of that freedom going on from generation to generation. So I hope we can understand what I'm saying, because it's important that we understand this principle. Now, I'm going to point out two hindrances to freedom of choice, two things that hinder it. And this is what came out in my discussion with this young lady, and it has made a deep impact on my thinking, because I realize it's the truth. And it explains to me why God is so silent, why God does not intervene more visibly and more frequently in the affairs of the human race. It has helped to answer some of my important questions. So these two things are, first of all, the irresistible demonstration of God. Let me explain what I mean. If somebody's about to do something, no, let me put it another way. There are many people in the world today who don't believe in God. They claim not to believe in God. Primarily people who are evolutionists. Many of them become atheists. And some who are not even believers in evolution. Well, not many of them, but maybe there are some of those who are also atheists. They claim not to believe in God. I've heard many of them say, if there is a God, let him send a blast of lightning now and I will believe. If there's a God, let such and such a thing happen. Let him prove himself and I will believe. You know, people who are atheists, they enjoy throwing out these kinds of challenges. And they seem to be legitimate points. It seems to make sense. But what I'm about to say now demonstrates that it really is foolishness on their part to make these kinds of demands and these kinds of requirements. But for many who are Christians, it does seem like it's a good point. Why doesn't God show himself so that people can believe in him? Because it seems to make sense. If there are people out there who would really make a change if they were to see some demonstration of power, why is God so silent? It is based on this principle of freedom of choice. It's based on the principle of freedom of choice. Because if God were to to reveal himself in a blaze of power, suppose, for example, somebody says, if there's a God, let there be a flash of lightning at this moment, and there's a flash of lightning. This person has little choice but to believe. You take away his freedom. You take away his freedom to do what is in his heart. He does not want God. He does not want to serve God, but God shows himself. If you see God, can you not be a believer? If you want to serve yourself and you want to live your perverted way of life, and then God shows himself, what are you going to do? 99% of those who say they don't believe in God would start believing, and they would start conforming out of fear. Not because they want to serve God, not because their heart is towards God, but because it's frightening when you come into the presence of God. If you will remember what happened at Mount Sinai, how many of those people really loved God? How many of them really knew God? How many of them really wanted to do the things of God? And yet everybody said, all that the Lord has said, we will do. They were scared into compliance, not through love or through the proper motivation. Because at Mount Sinai, God came down on the mountain and he operated on the principle, not the principle of free choice. I'm going to comment on this a little bit more in just a moment. But at Mount Sinai, God was building on the principle of the old covenant. And the old covenant is not based on freedom of choice. Not the same as under the new covenant. Under the old covenant, people were scared into compliance. They were not left with a choice. If you look at the Old Testament, you ask the question, why is it that God was so visible? Why is it that God was so present so many times? I mean, he parted the Red Sea. Could you not believe? He sent manna from heaven every day. Could you not believe? He came down on a mountain in lightning and thunder and a voice like an ocean. They heard it. They saw it. Could you not believe? There were so many miracles. They were not given, their freedom of choice was in a sense overwhelmed. They were not given the choice to believe in God or not to believe. The evidence was too overwhelming for them not to believe. And we can see this very easily. So the old covenant was not based on the principle, or it was not primarily founded on the principle of freedom of choice. Their freedom was overwhelmed by evidence. But I'm saying still that this was the old covenant. It was a part of that former system, and this is not God's eternal system. If you notice that since the new covenant, there has been far, far, far less display of the power of God. And what display there has been strictly according to a certain principle, which I'm going to comment on in just a moment. But that's one thing. In order to maintain freedom of choice, God has to refrain from using what is irresistible and what is indisputable. If he presents argument that cannot be disputed, then in a sense, He takes away your freedom of choice. So God gives us evidence, but not demonstration. Jesus says, an evil and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign. Even though Jesus was performing miracles, people came and said, show us a miracle, show us a sign that we can believe. They had all the evidence, and now they wanted more than evidence. They wanted a demonstration. If Jesus had moved a mountain, maybe they might have believed. But then they would have believed because it was impossible not to believe, not because they saw in him qualities that they admired, not because they really wanted to do the way of God, but because they could not help but believe. And this is what God will not do. He will not give demonstration. He gives evidence. So there is in nature, there is in life, there is all around us evidence of God. And when somebody comes along and says, prove to me that you are God, send a bolt of lightning, these people belong in the category of who Jesus referred to as a wicked and adulterous generation. So God gives evidence, but not enough evidence to overwhelm our true feelings. This way, he leaves us free. I found this to be true because I claimed that I didn't believe in God. When I was 17, I made the claim because I didn't want to believe in God. It was not that the evidence wasn't there. It was that my heart did not want to receive it because I wanted to live such a life that I knew I was heading for hell. If there's a God, I'm going to hell. So the easiest thing for me to do was to say I didn't believe in God. And I found the quote unquote the evidence that I was looking for. I found books with ideas that suited my narrative, what I wanted to believe. And so I went in that direction. But when I was 22 and I got myself into some trouble, some bad trouble, I found out that I always knew that there was a God. The evidence was there because in my trouble, I turned to God. I knew I had been lying to myself, deceiving myself for those 5 years. So God gave me freedom of choice, and I chose against God. But I also was fighting against the evidence. If God had appeared to me in those 5 years, if I'd seen an angel, if a supernatural visitor had appeared during the night, or I had seen a message written across the sky, I would have believed. But not because I wanted to, but because I was overwhelmed. My freedom would have been in that sense taken away from me. So God does not use the irresistible, and God does not use what is undeniable because people are left free to choose. It's interesting, and I just want to comment that, we can see that this also applies to the way Satan works. God does not allow Satan to operate on the basis of compulsion or force. If you can think about it, and you realize that if you were Satan, it would be easy for you to obtain control of the world. Just appear as an almighty super being, and the world would come and bow at his feet. And even though, many of us believe that sometime before the end of the world, Satan will be given this power. It will be under strict conditions. It will be when the world has already made up its mind, when freedom of choice has already been settled and everybody has chosen their place. Then Satan may be given that power. But God does not allow Satan that power today. The same conditions under which God operates. He limits Satan. If you question why is it that we don't see more of the power of Satan openly, this is the answer. Freedom of choice. This principle is so important that God limits himself and he limits Satan in order to leave us free. I was really blessed when I came to understand this because as I said, it answered so many questions. Under the old covenant, God set up a system based on the principles of this world. And the principles of this world are the principles of Satan. And Satan's principle is to take away your freedom. Well, let me modify that a little bit, because somebody might ask, am I saying that God operated on the principles of Satan? Let me put it another way. There are the principles of flesh, there are the principles of sight, there are the principles of the physical. Okay, under the old covenant, God was operating on the basis of the physical, not the spiritual. And I'll say more about that in just a moment. But you can see that everything under the old covenant was physical or visible. God appeared visibly. He demonstrated his power physically, lightning and thunder and loud noise. Everything under the old covenant was based on the physical. There was a physical temple, there was a physical lamb, there was physical worship, feast days, ceremonials. Everything was material and physical. Paul refers to it as carnal ordinances. Paul refers to the temple as a worldly sanctuary. Everything was of the elements of this world. That was the old covenant, because the old covenant was representational. It was type and illustration. It was not God's eternal principle. God set this up to be a teaching tool in preparation for something greater. Now, let me go to a passage in the Bible that I hold as probably the most fundamental. I mean, I've recently been looking at this passage, and I've seen that this passage is, just a second. Oh, all right. John, yeah, this is a passage I'm looking for. John chapter 4. This is one of those very interesting passages, because in this passage, Jesus is speaking to a woman who was not even somebody who, what we would call a decent person. This was a woman who was a husband. She moved around from man to man. She had 5 men in her life, and none of them was her husband. And this one that she had now was somebody else's husband that she had taken. And this is the woman that Jesus came to at that well in Samaria. And what is amazing to me is that this woman receives some of the most sublime truth. This is a turning point in the history of the planet. And Jesus reveals the truth to this woman that most people would not give a second thought to. Now, he comes to her at the well. And this woman, she is curious because, she belongs to a group of people that the Jews consider to be dogs. She's what we might call today an offshoot. She is half Jew. The Samaritans are part Jews. They're like people who have 1 foot in and 1 foot out. It's like if you want to compare it to a denomination, you would say the true Jews are, as Adventists would consider themselves to be the true Jews. And then those who break away from the church, they consider to be offshoots. You're halfway there because you kind of believe some of the doctrines, but you're out, so you're lost. That's how they saw these Samaritans. And so the woman is interested because Jesus is speaking to her, which the normal Jew would not do. And she has a question for Jesus. And she says in verse 20, it's John 4, verse 20. She says, our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you say that in Jerusalem is a place where men ought to worship. Her question is, where is the right place of worship? She is focused on worshiping God according to the physical, according to places, Jerusalem or this mountain. And Jesus says, woman, believe me, the hour cometh when you shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. All right, this is the beginning of his amazing statement. Jesus is not saying that nobody ever again will worship at Jerusalem. That is not his point, even though that is what the words say. You shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. He says nobody is ever going to worship God in this mountain, and nobody is ever going to worship at Jerusalem. That's what he says, but that's not what he means. What he means is, the time is coming when you cannot limit God. You cannot limit God to places. This was the old system of worship. You limit God to worship in a city, in a temple, in a certain apartment. This is a system that existed up to that point, the physical, material, visible worship. Jesus says in verse 23, but the hour cometh, the hour is coming, the time is coming, and now is, the time had arrived because Jesus had arrived. With the coming of Jesus, the moment had arrived when the true worshippers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is seeking for such to worship him. We have to consider, what does this mean? What does this mean? God is seeking for people to worship. And that's interesting because we often think that we are seeking for God. But God is seeking for people to worship. And he's seeking for a certain kind of worshiper. The worshiper he's seeking for is the one who worships in spirit and in truth. In other words, God is not happy. God is not enthused about those who worship in the other way. And what is the other way? Well, the converse of spirit, the opposite of spirit is flesh or material or carnal or worldly. There are people who worship according to what is physical. They worship in places. They worship according to visible rituals and ceremonials. This is the basis of their worship. Just like it was under the old covenant. Lambs and pots and washings and temples and ceremonials. This is physical worship. This is carnal worship. And Jesus says the hour had arrived when this was to change. Now, God was interested in moving people to spiritual worship. Spiritual worship in spirit and in truth. Spirit is invisible, but spirit is real. Spirit is reality. The spirit world is a real world. The physical world is the artificial world. And this is why we humans have it upside down. Jesus says God is trying to move us into what is real. God is seeking for spiritual worshipers. Why? Because those who worship in spirit, it means that they are understanding God. You know, Jesus said in John 17 and verse 3, this is life eternal, that they might know thee, the only true God, and the Jesus Christ whom thou hast sent. God says this is what eternal life means, that we know God. We know God as he is. We know God in his true identity, yes, but also in his true nature. The true nature of God is that God is spirit. The person who worships God in spirit, his mind is elevated beyond going to physical places to meet God. You understand that where you are, God is there. You understand that God lives inside of you. Your body is the temple of the living God. This is spiritual worship. You're not relating to God on the basis of what is outward and what is physical. Your worship is spiritual. You are seeing God the way he is. And so your concept of God and your worship of God is elevated. It is raised to a different level. And this is what God wants. God wants people who see him as he is, because then we relate to him as he is. It's kind of like, you know, seeing God. Those who are seeking for God in a physical way are more focused on the physical and the material. It's like the Jews were holy when they were around the temple, but then they went back to living their own way. And there are many people today who are like this in their relationship with God. They're holy when they go to the building to worship. They're holy when they are among other Christians. They're holy in certain places or on certain occasions. But other times they go back to being themselves because they don't worship in spirit and in truth. Jesus says the time has come. With the coming of Jesus, it was the great turning point in the history of the universe. God himself was no longer going to relate to humanity on the basis of physical interaction, on the basis of visible and material. We were graduating to something greater, something higher. This is what Jesus came to introduce into the dealing of God with people. And so he said, the time has come when you must no longer worship God in the physical and the representational, but in spirit and in truth. Truth here meaning what is real, what is the reality, the factual, not the representational, but in truth. In 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 18, it says, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal. They are physical, they are material, and they are also temporary. They are temporal and temporary. But the things which are not seen are eternal. So Jesus was saying, the time has come for God's people to worship him in the way of the eternal and not in the way of the temporary and the representational, but in the way of what is permanent and what is really the true state of the universe. In 1 Corinthians 15, verses 45 to 48, we see this emphasized again, the difference between the two covenants. We could say that the two covenants has to do with the kingdom versus the age of the law, the age of the kingdom versus the age of the law. It's the first Adam versus the second Adam. It's the first covenant versus the second covenant. It's the spirit versus the letter. It's the truth versus the representation. There are so many illustrations in the Bible, so many concepts in the Bible that focus on these two great realities. And we live in the age of the spirit, not in the age of the flesh. So the passage says, and so it is written, the first Adam was made a living soul, flesh, physical. The last Adam was made a quickening spirit. Jesus was raised as a spirit. He went back to heaven and was glorified as spirit. One gives physical life, the other gives spiritual life. Howbeit, that was not first which is spiritual, but that which is natural, just like the two covenants. And afterward, that which is spiritual. The first man is of the earth, earthy, carnal, physical. The second man is the Lord from heaven, spiritual. As is the earthy, such are they also that are earthy. And as is the heavenly, such are they also that are heavenly. This is why we worship in spirit and in truth, because we are spiritual beings. The real challenge that we have, brothers and sisters, I realize we weren't even looking at the verses. All right. The real challenge that we have is how to live in the spiritual world. That's the real challenge we have. Because, we are accustomed, we're trained. Excuse me a moment. From the moment we are born, we live in the physical world. That's what we are accustomed to. That's what we are trained to do. To live in and to believe in the physical. It's very, very difficult for us to interact with the spiritual because it's not our natural environment. I'm just going to ask you to bear with my voice. It's very early in the morning, and this happens in the morning. My voice gets a little rusty, so as long as you're hearing my words, it's okay. But I know that some people might be a little concerned about the fact that my voice seems to be going down, but it's this way when I just get up in the morning. So please bear with me, all right? So the challenge is to live in the unseen. That's the challenge we have as Christians. And I want to read a verse from the book of Hebrews. We're very familiar with this verse, but let's go there anyway and read it. It says, Hebrews 11 and verse 1. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. We're all familiar with this verse, but I want to ask us to just consider for a moment. We live in the spiritual realm. We worship God in spirit and in truth. And what we're focusing on today is the issue that God does not reveal himself. For the most part in our age, we don't see the hand of God. Let me give you an interesting statistic. This is something that was brand new to me. I never recognized this before I was preparing this presentation. Do you realize that the word faith is in the Bible 231 times? 231 times. Do you want to make a guess how many times the word faith appears in the Old Testament? 2 times. The word is in the Bible 231 times. It appears in the Old Testament. In the King James Version, it appears 2 times. In the New Testament, it appears 229 times. One place in the Old Testament is in Habakkuk 2 and verse 14, where it says, "The just shall live by faith." It's almost a prophecy of the future, because the Apostle Paul quotes that verse about 3 times. He can't find another verse in the Old Testament to use. That's the one he uses. The other one is a verse in Deuteronomy 32 and verse 20, which seems to be speaking more of faithfulness, our faithfulness in our dealing with God, or the faithfulness of those Old Testament believers. But it's not so much faith, but it's translated faith, but it's talking about faithfulness, commitment, loyalty to God. So I could say that the word faith really appears only in the book of Habakkuk. So the point I'm making is that faith is not an Old Testament emphasis, because, as I said, in the Old Testament, God was operating on the basis of power and might. And if you say why, because it was a representational system. God was seen, Jehovah was seen as one God among many gods. A part of his purpose was to show that he was stronger, he was greater, he was more powerful than any other God. That was a part of the Old Testament purpose of Jehovah. It's different in the New Testament. Somebody once said that the Old Testament is a covenant of prosperity. The New Covenant is a covenant of adversity. And that is partly true. But it's only because the Old Covenant is a covenant of the visible. The New Covenant is a covenant of the invisible. The Old is a covenant of the worldly and the physical. The New Covenant is a covenant of the spiritual. So this is a foundational thing to understand. Now Paul says that faith is a substance. And this also helps us to understand, because we humans, we believe in what we can see. Somebody says, how can I believe? Because I have not seen God. I have not touched God. Why does God expect me to believe? God says, I'm operating on the foundational principle of the universe, freedom of choice. I've set you free. I give you evidence and I set you free. And you say, how do I interact with what is not real? And God says, this is a real world. This is what is truly real. How do I interact with it, Lord? And God says, faith is a substance. See if we get the point. Faith is the reality. Through faith, we interact with what is real. Well, somebody asked a question recently, isn't that really kind of, believing in what is not true? But that is exactly the point. It is interacting in what is true. But the way you can interact with what is true but invisible, the way you can touch what is spiritual and invisible, is faith. Faith is a key. Faith is a door by which we step into the invisible world. It's not believing in what is not real. It's learning to touch what is not visible. It's learning to interact with what is spiritual. Faith is the avenue. Faith is the key. Faith is the door. So faith is the substance. So through faith, substance is something that you can measure and feel and touch and taste. But Paul says that faith gives us this substance, even though we cannot see, touch, feel, or smell it. Faith gives us the substance. Faith is the evidence. Faith makes it real. So it's important to understand that distinction. Faith is not living in a child's dream where you're imagining things. Faith is learning the method. Faith is a method of stepping into the world that we cannot see or feel or interact with physically. It's living, it's stepping into the realm of the true life of the universe. That's what faith does. That's what faith is. So faith gives us this privilege, and faith is the principle of the new covenant. Now somebody will say, well, what about Hebrews 11? In Hebrews 11, what we see is that the passage talks a great deal about the faith of those Old Testament believers. It says, by faith they did this, by faith they did this, by faith Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees, by faith Abraham offered up his son, by faith Moses left Egypt, by faith they subdued armies, overcame lions, and it talks about faith. So why am I saying that faith is not an old covenant principle? Well, notice something. In all of these cases of faith, it was not faith to believe in God, because believing in God was a given. They had all the evidences to believe in God. Their faith was that they learned to trust in this God. It's a little bit different, because in the New Testament, the evidences and the display of power is not there. We look at evidence, and we have to believe in God. We have to take the evidence and to believe in God without the display of power. There are very few people who ever see an angel or a blaze of light or a display of glory in order that they might come to believe in God. Very, very few. And the few who do, it's under certain very strict conditions that I will mention in just a moment, because God does not take away a person's freedom of choice. So when it says they had faith in the Old Testament, it's kind of like a little different. It was trusting in the God who they already knew existed. They didn't have to ask if God existed. What they had to ask was, can I trust in this God? Do I put my trust in him? So it was a little different when it talks about the faith of those Old Testament believers. So in actual fact, there are two categories of people who still see miracles today. They still see the evidences and the display of God's power. We can't deny this. We can't deny this. But what we do know is that it is far less frequent than in the time of the Old Covenant. And I'm going to explain why. And I'm going to explain under what conditions can we see God's hand? Can we see the display of God's power? Can we see this interaction in the spiritual realm? Well, let me start on the opposite side. Let me start from on the side of Satan, and I'll ask the question because it kind of gives you the answer. What kinds of people normally see things like, what kind of people does Satan actually show himself to? What kind of people have actually seen great display of satanic power? They have seen spirits. They get into seances where they actually see strange things happening. What kind of people are these? These are people who have become so closely aligned to Satan, so closely affiliated to Satan, that they actually know Satan as a reality. And so Satan appears in their lives. Satan appears to them, displays his power in their presence. And this helps us to understand what kind of people also see the display of God's power. When a person comes to the place where he believes, when a person comes to the place where he does not need to see miracles, then he will see miracles. If you see what I'm saying. In other words, God does not need to prove himself to this person. This person already believes in God. He has looked at the evidence, he believes the evidence, and he's absolutely convinced that there is a God. This person will see miracles because God is not taking away this person's freedom of choice when he shows himself. And this is why in the new covenant, faith as the basis for miracles, faith as the basis for miracles is so much emphasized. You see how many miracles they saw under the old covenant when they didn't trust God. But in the New Testament, Jesus says, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you can move the mountain. When he healed people, it was on the basis of faith. And he says that through faith, we can continue to do the same thing. But if we're experimenting with God, if we're saying, show yourself, prove yourself so I can believe, these are the people who will see nothing. When you believe and you know God and you're absolutely convinced, God can step into your life and do his works without removing your freedom of choice. And that is the point. So these are the one class of people who they see the display of God's power because they don't need it. That's the beautiful contradiction. They don't need to see the display of God's power, and therefore they see the display of God's power. It's kind of like, who are the people who find peace? They are the people who learn to rest. They are the people who stop fighting to find peace. The people who stop fighting are the people who find the answers to their problems. Those who fight can't find it. God says that as we rest, as we come to Jesus and we rest in him, then we find what we're really looking for. As we fight to help ourselves and struggle, we find that what we're looking for recedes further and further away from us. So that is one class of people who will see miracles, those who don't need it. And secondly, the second class are those people who believe in God, but they are ignorant of who God is and they are ignorant of the ways of God. God will also show himself to these people many times. If you read or listen to testimonies, go on YouTube and look at testimonies, you'll find that many people from pagan backgrounds or from from backgrounds of false religions, like a lot of people from the Muslim world. You go on YouTube and you'll find that many of them had encounters with Jesus. They had visions of Jesus, or they actually saw Jesus, or something supernatural happened that caused them to become Christians. And you are saying, why are these people seeing all of these things? And I, who am a Christian for all these years, I've never seen anything like this. It's because these people already believe in God. Many of these people believe in God more than many Christians believe in God. They believe in God so much that for the sake of God, they will blow themselves to pieces. They will go through any kind of suffering and hardship because they believe in God. They are like the Apostle Paul before he became Paul. When he was Saul, he believed in God with all his heart to the extent where he devoted his life to fighting for God in the way that he understood. This person has made a choice, but he has made a choice with an ignorant understanding of God. He does not understand who God is, but he believes in God. He's ignorant of who God is. He's ignorant of the ways of God, but he believes. This person wants to serve God, but he just doesn't know the truth. These people, God appears to without compromising his principle. He does not interfere with their freedom of choice, but he appears to them and he does not interfere with his principle because he leaves them free. He just gives them information, like he did with Paul on the Damascus Road. He gave him the information that he needed. He did not bring faith by this demonstration of power. He just brought information, which is all that Paul needed, because he was already honest in his heart toward God. And these kinds of people, God will demonstrate his power in order to bring them to a knowledge of the truth, because they already believe. So there are these two classes. Those who are ignorant, but they are sincere, they will see miracles. And those who truly already believe and don't need miracles, they will see miracles. So this is what I wanted to say today, and I hope that my message has been understood, because it has brought me a lot of it has brought a lot of peace to my mind, for first of all, for helping me to understand why it is that God does not display his power. What is it that restrains God? Now I understand more clearly. And secondly, I also understand why it is that many Christians do not see the power of God. And also why it is that some Christians do see the power of God. And why is it that faith is so foundational? Why has God made everything based upon faith? The answer is beautifully simple. It's because God builds exclusively on the principle of freedom of choice. This is the great answer that brings a lot of understanding. Thank you for listening today. I hope you have all been able to follow and to get the main point that I was trying to make, and I hope it has been a blessing. Let's bow our heads as we give thanks. Dear Father, thank you for being with us today, and thank you for your message. Father, I know that there have been limitations in my presentation, many limitations. But I know that you are the God of love and mercy, and that you will bless others who listen. So please bless the people at this camp meeting, my brothers and sisters. Draw them closer to yourself. Help them to understand you better. And may everyone be blessed when we come to the end of this meeting. Thank you, Father. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. God bless you all.